Hi everyone, my name's Zig Gibson. I go by the title of Jack of all trades, master of none. And today we'll be looking at the Kubler-Ross 5 emotional stages of grief. Dealing with bad news is a complex business. I've been reading the fascinating Oliver Sacks autobiography On the Move and was touched by his descriptions of his early neurology days interacting with patients whom he had to give bad news to about their diagnosis. And I was reminded of the earlier works and days of my medical career when I had to do similar. This week, a career project I've been working on for a while turned out not as I wanted it, and I noted my own response to the news when I got it. I've also been part of an interesting Twitter discussion on doping in sport involving the responses of those accused of doping to the accusations leveled against them. All of these got me thinking of the Kubler-Ross model of the emotional stages of dealing with bad news and grief, and how important they are in understanding one's own reactions and those one is interacting with or observing, and struggling to understand their actions and responses to receiving news or diagnosis as something that is either not welcome or positive. The Kubler-Ross model was generated by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a Swiss-American psychiatrist who worked with terminally ill patients and was horrified by how they were treated and managed, and by how death and dying in modern culture, in her case in the mid-20th century, were hidden by society and not talked about or acknowledged. She encouraged the medical students she taught to both confront death and dying and work with their patients to ultimately do so. As a result of her work, she published a book about her experiences on death and dying and proposed a theory called the 5 stages of grief model, outlining how people faced with death both respond to and cope with firstly the news of, then the process of their own death. The 5 stages included denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. While her work was controversial, with some scientists and clinicians believing the model to be too simplistic, it has in many ways stood the test of time and is now being used to explore other areas of grief and responses by individuals to bad news, and not just in the context specifically of death and dying. The first reaction to bad news in the Kubler-Ross model is denial. In this first stage, the individual receiving bad news believes that the diagnosis, information, or news is mistaken and refuses to accept it and clings to a false, preferable reality. There are several defined types of denial, including 1, simple denial, where the reality of the unpleasant news or facts is denied altogether. 2, minimization, where the bad news is acknowledged, but its seriousness is denied. This is, in effect, a combination of both denial and rationalization. And 3, projection, where both the bad news and its seriousness is acknowledged, but responsibility for the bad news is denied by blaming somebody or something else. This denial phase is followed by a phase of anger, when the individual recognizes eventually that the denial phase cannot continue, either due to progression of symptoms faced with a terminal or life-threatening illness, when evidence of facts supporting the bad news becomes overwhelming, and they become frustrated and lash out at those around them, or at the bearer of the bad news. The third phase is bargaining, which implies a sense of hope that the individual can in some way overcome the bad news by making some bargain or compromise, such as a reformed lifestyle, with or without the comprehension that such bargaining is futile and will not change the situation in any way materially. The fourth phase is depression, where the individual becomes aware that the mathematical probability of their impending death is overwhelming, or that the bad news is certainly true, and becomes depressed and goes into their own shell, refusing visitors or communication about anything, let alone their illness or bad news. The fifth and final stage is acceptance of what has happened or what is coming, and in this important last stage, individuals accept whatever fate has befallen them, either prepare for their impending death or accept the bad news as real, but with stable emotions and a feeling of calmness and acceptance. All these stages are clearly part of a complex pattern of coping behavior, which allows the individual to not completely collapse and become catatonic in the face of bad news, which allows them to eventually move on to a state of acceptance of an altered state of being that is imperfect or not was the ideal state of the individual either at the time before they received the bad news or for their future life plans. Why folk need to go through all these stages and not jump immediately to the phase of acceptance is not completely clear, but it is suggested that the process is needed to integrate new, unexpected information that dramatically conflicts with previous beliefs or plans, and which threatens one's personal identity, life plans, or way of life in a potentially permanent and negative way. Kubler-Ross suggested that not all individuals go through all 5 phases sequentially, although and that some individuals could cycle through some of the stages in a repetitive rather than a linear way, and that an individual's personal surrounding environment could be a factor in influencing the use of a specific cycle. But, in her opinion, all folks do go through at least 2 of those stages after receiving bad news or a terminal clinical prognosis. Her work led her to believe that if one did not go through such stages, one would remain in denial and continue to fight death, or the bad news, whatever it is, or be paralyzingly afraid of it, and therefore endure a more difficult and less dignified death or an ongoing maladapted lifestyle or way of life. Although it has been pointed out that not confronting death or bad news is for some individuals an adaptive process in itself. Interestingly, she believed that the stages were a form of communication, either externally or with oneself, and a way of someone being able to review and compare both their past life and their current state, and process this information in an ordered way that would be helpful to both the individual and those assisting them, once they realized and understood that their emotions were part of an ordered and structured process. Because of this, Kubler-Ross supported the concept of hospice care movements, which supported folk with terminal illnesses during their last days, and as they went through the psychological cycle described above, rather than the concept of euthanasia, which to her prevented people from completing the unfinished business before they died, or accepting whatever loss of pride, prestige, or lifestyle loss the bad news signified or entailed. Both Kubler-Ross and others became aware that the model could be used in a variety of settings and situations where bad news was involved, be it children grieving during a parent's divorce, grieving for a lost relationship, or problems with substance abuse. As in the examples above, it can also be potentially be used when some work which one has invested a large amount of emotional energy is irretrievably lost or rejected with no prospect of a comeback, or when an athlete fails a drug test that is shown to be true, has enormous impact not just on the fidelity of their past achievements and successes, but also on their current social status and perhaps even future financial well-being. It has also been noted that particularly during the denial and anger phase, folk can cause a lot of harm to those around them, either by projecting blame for their actions as part of the denial process onto those informing them of the bad news, or discussing such news either personally or in the media. Denial can take the form of denial of impact, 1, when it is related to continuing behavior which is harmful both to the person themselves or those around them. Denial of cycle, when related to repetitive patterns of behavior that are ongoing, unchanging, and negative. 3, denial of awareness, where motivating factors are used to lessen the severity of the bad news. And 4, most difficult to manage, denial of denial, which is an extreme form of self-delusion where the person convinces themselves that the bad news or evidence of bad actions in themselves is not true. All these forms of denial are major impediments to both changing behavior and allowing the 5 grief stages to progress to the stage of acceptance and psychological peace. Folk who are in denial can clearly provide potentially great challenges and negative consequences to both themselves and to those around them who are attempting to assist them come to terms with their current life status or condition. Whether the Kubler-Ross 5 stages are real or not, or actually occur in sequential fashion, as outlined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, they are important in helping us understand the behavior, often actually negative in those facing terminal illness, or the effect of bad news either in one's family, social, or work environment. In our modern Western society, death and dying is swept under the carpet and not talked about or acknowledged almost at all. This in many ways perhaps makes it more difficult to come to terms with our own mortality when it is challenged or when we get our own terminal death sentence from a doctor we go to for a roaring symptom that will not go away. Furthermore, in modern society, actually probably since the time of the first origin of any society, most folk have developed a need to project an aura of success and vitality, and have a belief that to be successful in society they need to do such. Because of this, when we get bad news or negative outcomes that could materially or socially affect our life and lifestyle, this becomes difficult to accept because of the perceived loss of status or future well-being or acceptance in the broader society, which folk perceive will be the case if the bad news or evidence of non-prior optimal behavior becomes public knowledge. But people do accept and admire someone that says sorry unreservedly. People do accept failure when it is acknowledged and learned from. People not just accept but want to help those they love who are ill or dying. So when one is confronted with someone behaving badly after they receive news that is not to their liking, perhaps we need to understand that they're going through some part of the Kubler-Ross cycle, though we have to be careful not to exclude the possibility of overt sociopathy or personality disorders in those behaving such. We also have to understand that when we hear bad news of others, particularly those whom we are close to, be it one's child, spouse, parent, friend, or work colleague, this may trigger a similar Kubler-Ross cycle in oneself at the same time as other persons going through similarly. And this can become mutually challenging and comorbid. Each one of us faces bad news of varying degrees on almost daily basis. Unless one dies unexpectedly and suddenly of a heart attack, each one of us is destined to eventually hear a definitive diagnosis and prognosis from a well-meaning clinician that we have a terminal illness and that our days are numbered. The challenge for us to try and accept these setbacks and bad news with the best grace possible, and be aware that sometimes our own responses, whether denial, anger, or depression, are part of a cycle of psychological healing. Rather than fight these emotions, we need to attempt to work with them to get as quickly as possible to a state of acceptance and peace about wherever our journey is due to take us as a contents of that fateful discussion that brings us the bad news that is first so difficult to accept. As the great saying goes, of time you would make a stream upon whose bank you would sit and watch it flowing, if the timeless in you is aware of life's timelessness and knows that yesterday is but today's memory and tomorrow is but today's dream. Perhaps an overt awareness of the inevitability of one's death, and that one surely will receive bad news and have failures despite all of one's best efforts as part of the natural process of life and time passing, makes us appreciate more each day that ends well, and allows us to wake up at the start of the new day hopeful for its outcome, yet aware each day could bring some life-challenging negative end to us. All we can do is deal with the bad news if and when it comes, and eventually with time and the Kubler-Ross cycles, accept it, even if we wish that the river of life to pause or flow back, something which it surely never can do. The last words of General Stonewall Jackson, the superb Confederate military leader in the American Civil War, who died of pneumonia after being shot by his own men by mistake and losing his arm, were, "Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees on the other side." Words said apparently to his wife, who had come to be by his side with a smile on his face. The prior life until we get that really bad news is surely something like a flowing river or stream, which after the bad news arrives becomes a raging sea. But this raging sea may be part of a planned accumulation of underlying currents, which enables one to get as quickly as possible and eventually safely and calmly to that other shore, wherever and whatever that far shore is or will be. Thank you for listening. If you've liked this, please push like or and thanks for listening.